This is Chris Jansen with End Evil Podcast. End Evil Podcast is dedicated to truth and freedom, reaching out to people who have the imagination to envision a world without evil and who are willing to begin working towards that goal and imagine that it is possible. Today I have with me an awesome guest, Andy Brooksher. He's a gentleman I met through Mark Passio. We've been studying together in the True Media course. We're actually both graduates as of last week. So welcome to the podcast, Andy. How you doing?
Awesome. I'm doing great. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here, Chris.
Yeah, man, this is good because we've got to chat a little bit here and there, but today we could get a little more in depth and talk about what we're discussing is the most powerful weapon in the world, which is the weapon of propaganda and media. And we want to try to break that down a little bit for folks so the folks can understand why the world is in the state it's in and why we're so surrounded by evil. So, Andy, you've been doing your own work. I know I saw you have greenriveralchemy.com, correct?
That's right.
And the Green River Alchemical Society. So is that something you've been doing for a while, or is that pretty new?
Yes to both. It's something that I first had the kind of seed for, 5 years ago was when the idea first kind of started to solidify as a way to start to reach out and try and network with others who were kind of, realizing or had realized or were in the study of, basically just the topic of, hey, there's things going on beyond the veil of what we're presented with as happening in the world. And being that once you kind of get past a certain point, once you get so deep in the rabbit hole that it's very difficult to come back, you often turn around and realize a lot of the people that you used to associate with are not going to be following you on this journey, not going to be coming with you. So I started having the idea of building a community of kind of like-minded people, just, for no other reason than to let people know that there's others out there thinking along these lines. And, that might not be just some guy on the other side of the world, but people kind of right around you in your own community. And so at the time I live in Washington State. I'm right actually in Seattle right now. But 5 years ago, I lived closer to Mount Rainier, which is right at the headwaters of the Green River. And there's a lot of similar to the idea of green, the idea of rivers and how that relates to journeys, how green relates to care and unification of consciousness and all those things. GRAS then became, grass, and grass grows and grass is green. And so there was just a lot of things that I thought, what should I call this thing that really made sense? And so I kind of started the society 5 years ago and kind of sort of, put it out there. I did a couple Craigslist posts back in those days and started to kind of just reach out and built a fairly small community in my area of people that I could, just, talk to and kind of network with a little bit. And that kind of was up and down and petered out more than anything over a couple of years. And so I decided this year when all of the events of this year began to really get kicked into high gear, that I should take it online and really reach the broadest possible community that I can. And so that's kind of the impetus of the society, and the idea kind of behind making it a society is that it was kind of a play on, kind of a tongue-in-cheek play on, it's a secret society. And that's the first thing that people should know. I should have started out by saying the first thing that you should know about the Green River Alchemical Society is we are a secret society, and you should tell everybody that. We are totally decentralized, and we encourage everybody to begin their own chapter. And you can get free real estate and start your own chapter of the Green River Alchemical Society. And the best place to find that real estate is that 1 square foot between your ears. And you can make yourself the head of your own chapter of the society, and don't report back to Central. Just go ahead and do whatever it is that you want to do to network with other societies, with people outside of the society, and just people in their own flowing down their own river of truth, and so that's kind of been the impetus behind it. And lo and behold, when I started the society, I was living at the headwaters of the Green River, and now I live a mile and a half from where the Green River empties out into the Puget Sound, right in the heart of Seattle. So in many ways, the journey has kind of come to a
Full circle, huh?
full circle. Yeah, we've come up one rung on the spiral and hope to continue to keep the circle moving in an upward kind of spiral.
And that is sort of the essence of alchemy too, right? Like you said, in between our ears. And something I talk about in this podcast constantly is our own spiritual journey. And that is being the solution to ending evil. The beginning of the solution, at least, is to start within ourselves. So I really encourage other folks and listeners to this is to start by looking in yourself, and we can go from there. So, also part of that looking in ourselves is understanding the world around us and understanding why things are the way they are and asking the big questions. I've always been, even before I got into subjects of truth and freedom, like really curious about mysteries, right? And mysteries like Bigfoot or aliens or UFOs or giants, and eventually I started bumping up against some of the more difficult subjects. And I think for me, September 11th was like what really cracked that shell open and made me start looking in a different way. And that's when I got in that rabbit hole you're describing. And since then, the rabbit holes just opens up to more and more tunnels, and you go down more and more lanes, and it gets to the point where there is no going back at all. So I'm curious, what was for you? What cracked the nut for you that really kind of changed your direction in life?
Well, September 11th was a big event for me, although I wouldn't realize it until a couple of years later, probably about 6 or 7, when I started hearing more and more people talking about how this was not what it appears to be. You could say inside job, you can say this, that, or the other, but there's certainly more going on to the story. Was kind of the first thing that there's enough people saying that I started to say, okay, so what else is going on? But so that was a couple of years afterwards when I really started to kind of go a full bore down the rabbit hole. I was raised in the Christian church, Presbyterian denomination, and went to a private Christian school through 8th grade, then went to public high school, and then did a couple of years at a Christian university, which said you didn't have to be Christian to go there, which was a strange thing to say, but that's what they said. And that was really when it started so September 11th was my end of my junior year of high school. And so then when I got to college in 2003, 2004, or 2002, 2003, and then into 2004, but 02 and 03 especially, I was taking these, required classes about the history of the church and theological stuff. And the big kind of cracking point for me was when I was taking a class on the history of church, taught that's a word now, taught by taught by the dean, or I guess deacon of students. So he was like the head pastor, spiritual head of the student body on the staff, university staff, basically. And he was our professor for this class, and was telling us about the Council of Nicaea, which, for those of you who don't know, was a body of theologians and scholars assembled in Nicaea in Greece in 1332, 33, 30, or 13, excuse me, 332, 33, around there, by was that Constantine? No, I'm losing my, yes,
I think it was Constantine.
Yes.
That sounds right.
Not Alexander the Great. He was earlier. Yes, Constantine.
Yeah, Constantine.
Who had decided that, before the big battle, he had decided that now we're all going to be Christians. And the whole reason that they won the battle, according to the story as it's told, is that because he decided he's had a vision the night before, and everybody was now a soldier of Christ. And so they went out and won the battle. And now he was going to change the world and change Rome, which Rome at the time was centered in modern day Istanbul, which was renamed Constantinople after Constantine, of course. And so the first thing that he needed to do was to get together and formalize a religion for his newly found faith. And he basically, there's a lot of interesting kind of ways to interpret the story, but I think the most prevalent one is basically that he locked a bunch of scholars and theologians in a room and said, either you can come up with the story that we need to be telling based on these old writings, or I will find somebody who can, and you will no longer be around to tell your side of the story. And so they came up with what we know as the Bible today. And he, as we're learning all this, and obviously he didn't, there was no under the threat of execution in the telling at university, but realizing that, wait a second, so 300 years after Christ was supposed to live, there were just a bunch of Greek guys who got together and decided what books were going to be in the Bible. And you're telling me there are books that were written by people in the Bible that weren't allowed to be in the final edit of the Bible? Like, what's that about? And started asking some of these questions, and the professor basically was just like, we're not discussing that, which to me was odd because I'm paying all this money, it was 25 grand a year or something for this private college at the time. And it's like, I'm paying all this money for you to teach me, and I'm not allowed to explore these issues that are a part of our curriculum. I'm supposed to accept exactly what you're telling me and write a paper exactly regurgitating it and just think that that's enough. I'm paying for this. I should be allowed to explore and learn in a way that makes sense to me. So that was a big eye-opening thing for me. And from there started to look into some of the very much occulted, secreted history of the Christian church, and moved back to Denver, Colorado, where I was from originally, for a little while, and then moved back permanently to Seattle in 2005. Yeah. And met some people up here, including one very good friend of mine named Dave, who was very much into 9/11 truth, and very, very, he was, I don't know, 8 or so years older than me, and very much farther along his journey of discovery, and started talking to him about the kind of secrets of the church. And he basically said, here, you should look at this. And it was one of the early Michael Tsarion Origins and Oracles series. I can never remember exactly which DVD. He said, here, I have this, you should just go watch it. I think it was Sidereal Mythology, Astrotheology and Sidereal Mythology, although that might have been later. But anyway,
I love that series.
Yeah, that Origins and Oracles series, I was living with a couple of guys living in a house in Seattle, and basically we all had the day off, and it was like, get up, get our coffee, kind of sit down. I was like, guys, I want to watch this thing, and you guys are welcome to too. And we all actually worked together, and we worked with Dave, and so they were like, yeah, sure, put it on. And it was like 7 or 8 hours later, however long that presentation was, that we're all just sitting there just like,
whoa.
You're getting this, right? This isn't just me. Okay. And so, we watched it. I think we watched it twice over the course of a week, and then basically went back to Dave, said, here, give us the rest of them, and watched Alien Visitation and Subversive Use of Sacred Symbols and all the Origins and Oracles. I mean, it was like in a month, I just downloaded all of that stuff. And from there, it was like, okay, there's really no going back. That was definitely my red pill month or whatever. And so that was about 2007 or 2008. I can never quite keep track. Starting to look a little bit into 9/11, and then the bank crash happened, and I'd always been interested in kind of financial and history generally, but financial history too. And it was literally like 6 months before the crash happened that Dave, again, my friend, said, you should read this book. I hear what you're into. You should read this book, and hands me The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And I was like, oh, this is way deeper than, 2000 years ago. This is, still happening. And it's been, and so that was really the beginning. And
all downhill slide from there,
all down the
one or
all
the
down
other.
the hole or up the spiral, or whatever from there. So
there's a lot of stuff you brought up that hits home with me, because I grew up in the Christian church as well, and my dad was a preacher, and he, our house was full of Bibles and concordances, and he loved talking about that type of stuff. And so I was well steeped in Christianity, and not just Christianity, because he was into anything metaphysical. And So I was like, when I was 13, I had a cross around my neck, and I took my Christianity pretty seriously, although I probably wouldn't fit in with just any Christian even at that time. But it was pretty rough for me when I got to be like 18 or 19 and just totally had to break away from that whole, what I now call the storytelling. I've been talking about that recently in some of my podcast episodes, because what I came back to is this idea of natural law, and where I know I always felt like there was definitely a lot of realness to my spiritual experience, even in the Christian environment, because I'd have these synchronicities in life, and these conversations with some deeper aspect, and then, but then all the storytelling part of it just kind of blew me away. Like, this is a lot of bullshit. Like you're saying, you discover things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or these other stories that you're like, wait a second, these biblical stories are based on another story that was written before that story, and then, yeah, you start hearing about Nicaea. So yeah, a lot of what you're saying was, I feel very familiar with that journey myself. But the key part of it for this episode is the part where, like you're saying, that who told this story? This Constantine guy comes and says, no, this is the way we're going to tell the story. And so that does, as it turns out, in history, all the things we've read are usually told by the victor, or the person who had the biggest arm of violence or aggression, who was able to shut everybody else out. So, I guess the next question for you is, why is the world evil, and who's making it that way?
Oh, that's the big question.
Now that you've done all this studying, you should know the answer, right? As if it's that simple.
Why is the question? Why is the question? Well, uh, I guess to try and maybe I'll try and go at it from a couple of different angles and see if I can't get to the center of it. But to answer the question why, which is certainly the most important question, is the world evil? Yes or no? That's pretty straightforward. But why? Um, and if we are looking around and seeing that something has caused the world to be evil, we have to look back at what the cause is and try and identify that. And I think, gosh, part of the reason is, so I'll kind of start with this angle. Part of the reason is that a lot of the a lot of people, and this is, yeah, I'll start with this and then kind of spin to the other. But a lot of people are not willing or ready. I would even say ready to start to do the work of researching, looking into and behind things, and arriving at their own truth, and taking the leap of faith of, maybe I'll come to a conclusion that later I'll find out I was wrong about. But even before you get to that point, you have to dedicate yourself to going out and exploring an information from a variety of sources, and integrating that as much as possible with the other information, with the way that it resonates you and the things that you do know, and ingesting all of that. And it is hard work. It is a time commitment. You have to spend your time doing that. You have to pay attention to the things that are going on, and a lot of people would rather use their psychological currency for other things that are much more immediate in their return, even though usually that immediate gratification is extremely short-lived, whereas spending and investing that time and attention brings you a much longer, farther, and healthier gratification and psychological and spiritual satisfaction. But part of the reason I said some people aren't ready is it's not necessarily so much that they're just not in a place in their lives, although that's part of it. But now, if we look back at the Council of Nicaea and the kind of question of the media and the control of the narrative, which is really kind of what I think we're trying to get to the heart of as much as anything. When you look back 2,000 years ago, 300 AD, why did Constantine go after why did he want to consolidate the Bible first? Well, that was the main narrative. And it wasn't even like people were reading the Bible back then. Very few people in 330 AD were able to read. Greek was a very high court language, and therefore the Bible wasn't being read by the people. The Bible was being interpreted for the people by that layer of priest class that controlled that era of the narrative. And so people for basically the last 1700, the last thousands and thousands of years, but since the Bible, most people have not had access to actually read the Bible. So how can you go about, even, from a human kind of psychological, big picture, group consciousness kind of standpoint, go from all the information is right now available, and 100, 200, 300 years ago, it was really hard to get at information, to being able to know how to actually intake and parse that information for yourself, when for so much of human history, for the massive people, human history has been about taking your information from another source, like your priest, like the guy who has come from the next village over with news. You have no way of validating that. You have to take his word for it for the most part. So there's that. But I guess really, to get to the heart of it, it all comes down to truth. It all comes down to our willingness to work for truth, to find out what truth is. And maybe even the deeper level thing there is, a lot of people don't even believe that truth exists. And that might be the heart of it. We might have evil because people don't believe that there's good. If you don't believe in truth, you don't believe that there's good in the world. If you're a solipsist, which is somebody who, you probably covered this term on your podcast before, if you're a solipsist, you don't believe that there's anything true outside of yourself or your perceptions, the lights that are going off in your brain, if that even exists, in which case good and evil don't exist. And so good can't exist. And therefore, why should you work to do good? Why should you try to be good? Good is a figment. And that really is, to me, the heart of it. Is that there is a highly solipsistic mentality to most people, because most people just aren't willing to believe or accept is a better word, that truth does exist, and that it is discoverable. So hopefully I answered the question in kind of a packaging
you did a
for
really
the
good
topic.
job, because I actually asked way too broad of a question. I threw at you like a whole world of a problem for you to try to answer, and you did an excellent job of kind of summing it up. And it's really, what you're pointing to is moral relativism.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's something I talk about a lot too. And I think that is the problem. And the reason, part of the reason that's happened is, for a long time, people in positions of authority have spread that myth in all kinds of ways. And because it works out well for authority, if the masses of people are confused about the basic reality they live in, they're easier to control. So, from my point of view, there is this massive control that's very centralized. And what I found is, I'll get into conversations with people. We were talking about 9/11. I kind of had a similar experience to you, where when it happened, I right away saw some bullshit. I was just like, nope, that wasn't the planes. There's something else going on there. But it took me another 8 or 10 years till I really dug in. So it took some time before I really got curious and started looking at this information, and found the architects and engineers. So, like you're saying, it takes a lot of time to dig through all the layers of information out there, and there's so much propaganda. So I was curious to see, how would you describe to someone, like who's a newcomer to subjects of truth, like where do they start? How do they start? Because the people I talk to, like on a construction job site, for instance, I can get them talking about 9/11, and they'll get curious, and they'll even say like, yeah, I see, I definitely see some of the problem there. But where they really get stuck is they go, there's no way it can all be controlled by just a few people. There's no way, no one has that much organization or power. So how do we break that down for people? That how do they do it? How do these controlling elites control so many people?
Oh, well, I
Yeah.
the first kind of thing that I pivot to when I get a question like that is, to ask, and I like to do this. I think it's a very useful technique when talking to people who are on the fence or on the outside of, or, you know, sitting at the top of the rabbit hole, kind of maybe looking over the edge, um, is to come back with kind of a dialectic. Okay, that's an excellent question. Well, I have a question for you. What happens when there's a crime? What's the first thing that the investigator does when he thinks a crime has happened, or sees that a crime has happened, to try and find out who did it and why? And one of the first things that almost always happens, I mean, there's really two reasons for a crime. One is jilted love. So, you know, you could maybe go that route and look into that. And I certainly encourage people to. I think there is a strange level, and that's a more spiritual and less physical reason why this is happening. And I'm not really going to get into that, because the second reason, which is much more material, and I think is a lot better for people coming at that question. But okay, so, you know, people, because of, you know, love quarrels or whatever, crimes happen. The other reason, and the bigger reason, is money. So my question to you is, if investigators, when they think a crime has happened or they know a crime has happened, they're trying to figure out who, what, and why, is to follow the money. And if you really start to look at and really dig into the money thread of 9/11, and that's a great example because it's fairly easy with, you know, follow kind of one thread leads you to another thread, leads you to another thread with 9/11. If you really start to go, okay, I'm just looking at where the money's going and coming and going, that really starts to, you know, if you do nothing else, if you're interested in learning more about 9/11, go follow the money. And if you do that, you're going to see how wide this is, because ultimately, at some point, you are going to go back to, and you'll go much farther than this if you keep going, but you're going to go back to the creation of the Federal Reserve System and its implementation in 1913 after the Jekyll Island meeting, which this is why that is one of the key books in my lifetime that I've ever read, was The Creature from Jekyll Island. Understanding that there were these six or seven bank CEOs, you know, in the parlance of our day, presidents and high-level bank operatives, and a couple of politicians who were deep in on and had been working for years on Senate subcommittees for banking, all came together under the cover of nightfall. They all met up at this train station in New Jersey. They all had to come alone so that they wouldn't be seen, two of them together going to the train station, because that would have been a dead giveaway. If somebody says, I saw this guy and this guy at the train station getting on a train in the middle of the night together, they would have known. And they get onto a private train car and go down to Georgia to a resort where they could be totally isolated. 9 days later, they head back to New York and Washington, their respective locations. And within a year, the Federal Reserve Plan is in place. And what is that? Well, that's, let's create money out of thin air and put everybody in debt, make everybody a debt slave. And not only do you control the people, or start to control the people, and you're able to consolidate control because you're able to control the money supply, but then you are also able to control the way that the financial markets work. And when you can do that, you know, it didn't even take 6 years, you know, 1913, 7 years. The first major, I mean, it was 7 years after, oh, we have this great new banking system, 1913. And 1920, there was a huge market crash. And they were able to rebound that into 1921. We had the Roaring 20s. 8 years later, Great Depression. And it's just the cycle of this, which is totally manufactured. And you can see that going right up into and leading right up into, and follow the money from there into 9/11, and how it was such a boon for so many people that were so closely connected to central banking interests and the Federal Reserve. And there were huge stores of information in one of the Twin Towers. I can't remember which one, but basically one of the great repositories for the banking records was in the Twin Towers. And chances are the information was taken out of there safely and secreted away, but then they were able to turn around and said, well, our information was in that building and you just saw it get destroyed. So I'm sorry, I don't know what I can tell you. I don't have those records. And to keep on the follow the money, just make kind of one quick and final point about that is On September 10th, Donald Rumsfeld comes out and says, oops, guys, we goofed. Here at the Pentagon, we can't keep track of or have lost track of $2.3 trillion. We just don't know where it is. But don't worry, we'll start looking into that and we'll start going through our accounts row by row if we have to.
And how convenient that a plane managed to crash right into the accounting.
And if you haven't been, if you haven't been to Washington, if you haven't been to DC, I was in DC when I was, I don't know, 13 or something for a family vacation. If you haven't driven by the Pentagon, you have no idea how unimaginably large that building is. It is huge. Of all the places that a plane could have hit, it hits the accounting office of the Pentagon. And then they go, well, guess we don't have to look into where the money went, do we?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that I think if people really start to follow the money with 9/11, that you start to lead to bigger, wider and wider rings of control. And I've said now for basically this whole year, particularly the last 6 months, it's kind of really become a formalized saying, well, all the conspiracy theories, or you're a conspiracy theorist, or I'm a proud conspiracy theorist. And I say, okay, cool. I have no problem with the term. First of all, I don't think conspiracy theorist means what a lot of people think it means. I mean, just the term doesn't mean what you think it means. The actual words mean something other than what people semantically have ingrained. But I'm fine. You call me a conspiracy theorist if you want. That's fine. I'm a control theorist. My theory is that this is all about control. That's my theory. So,
and people get, I heard one time on a podcast by Freeman, who I like a lot, and he was pointing out the difference between a mystery and a conspiracy. And, like I was talking about before, something like Bigfoot, now you have a mystery, right? Something like 9/11 is definitely a conspiracy, just because we don't know exactly who did exactly what parts of that. We know that there were more than two people putting their heads together to come up with a plan, even if that was the narrative that was told to the public, which brings me to the point of the narrative and the information that we get, which seems to me to be a key aspect of the ability for the very few elites to control so many people by controlling that narrative. And again, 9/11 is a great example of that. But, it goes back to other times in history. We could think of the Bay of Tonkin. We could think of the Reichstag fire in Germany. Any number of what we would call now false flag events, where the story that's told to the public frames the thinking of the public, and the control of the media is probably, would you say, the most important tool or weapon of the controlling factions in the world?
Yeah, I would say it's certainly the first cornerstone that has to be laid. We were kind of pre-show about how anytime you see, not anytime, but so many times, if you have a successful revolution, a successful invasion, or a successful coup in a country, the first thing that gets controlled is the means of disseminating information. So that's certainly maybe the first major cornerstone. It's certainly not the last, but maybe the most powerful. I mean, people are hardwired in a sense to, maybe not hardwired, it's not the right word, but so much of our experience in this realm, in this reality, is based on the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and the story we tell ourselves about how ourself or that story relates to the other stories in the world. So controlling any or all of those narratives certainly it goes a long way to start to lay the foundation for external control of an individual. Because if you can hamstring the way that they're telling their story about themselves, you can certainly start to manipulate them into understanding the story that you want them to think about themselves. And then you can start to get them to believe in moral relativism and abdicate their individual sovereignty. And you can do one of those two things, but both of them in conjunction, man, you got somebody right where you want them if you're trying to control them.
Controlling the information. I think it was, I was just looking recently at an old video. I think it was the church committee where they were grilling somebody from, was it FBI or CIA?
CIA, yeah.
Operation Mockingbird, right? Where
Yep.
they do you have people in Hollywood, that are hired, from the deep state? And then it's like, well, yeah, we do, and how many? There's a lot, and how deep does that go? And how many of the modern outlet medias do you think are honestly telling the truth, or
Well,
trying to, because I think a lot of people think, your average person that I meet seems to think that turning on the TV and watching the news is a good source of information.
right. I
And
would
why should
say
they not
that
think that?
to answer the first question, I'll cycle back to the why they shouldn't think that. I would say the number of, if you had to take it on a percentage basis, the number of mainstream media outlets worldwide, whether it's the Daily Mail or the Telegraph in the UK, or I don't know, the Mumbai Times, whatever they have in India. I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head from somewhere else in the world. Tokyo Evening News, or Bangkok World, or what's the Chinese
I don't know.
China Today, or whatever. I see it all over. In Seattle, we have a fairly large Asian population, and there's a free Chinese. It's an American language paper, but it's about all of those. So all of these things, to the CBC in Canada, to any mainstream media source. I would say worldwide, the percentage that are actually trying to tell the truth is between 0 and 5%, and probably a lot closer to 0 at this point. And you start to talk about the consolidation and control. And when you can control the money, you can buy all the papers, you can buy all the news media. And right now, as it stands, AOL Time Warner, so AOL Time, Warner Brothers, Walt Disney, Bartelsman, which is the big print publisher as well. I mean, they've got other, but the big print publishers: Bartelsman, Viacom, News Corp, and Vivendi. Those are the 6 companies that control, I think, 98% of what you would think of as the mainstream media. And those 6 companies, again, if you follow the money, are very, very closely connected. It's not it all out of the. It's actually fairly regular happening that a high-ranking member of one of those corporations will have come from the is it FEC? No, I'm blanking on SEC, Securities Exchange. No, will have worked in government and allowed a little more monopolization, a little more consolidation. Will have allowed to get news print media to get away with a little bit more, and then they from a position in a cabinet, or from a position in the Senate, and or as an advisor or a lobbyist, and then turn around and become a high-ranking executive inside of one of those corporations. And it's the revolving door between government and the private sector, which is certainly, even in the mainstream media, they talk about, oh, this guy was he worked for Monsanto, or he's the new president of Monsanto. Well, before that, he worked for the USDA, and gave Monsanto a pass on something that they should have gotten raked over the coals for. But so even then, the acknowledgement that there's this revolving door between government and these corporations is certainly acknowledged. However, the media is far less likely to talk about the fact that a lot of the people that work for the media have recently worked for government. And if people want to look at Anderson Cooper and his history, and where he was a major talking head on CNN or whatever, MSNBC, I don't know, I can't keep track of them. But Anderson Cooper, go look into who he was before he got his job at, I think, CNN. And that's a pretty telling thing. And certainly the church committee, that's an excellent thing to bring up. That was in my notes there. I just kind of checked that off the list. And so maybe I'll go into this now. The church committee was Senate investigation, or joint investigation, into the CIA's activity with controlling the media, and it basically didn't turn up anything too useful or too, too long standing. It was kind of, oh, we'll have this hearing and people will get upset. And then a year later, kind of everybody had forgotten about it. Well, in 1977, then the New York Times, of all places, came out with an article uh, um, that was entitled "The CIA's." This is the title of a New York Times headline, 1977, December. It's actually was right around Christmas, which not a lot of people read the paper around Christmas. So that's an interesting time to do that. But CIA's Global Propaganda Network. Oh, the Times article is called Worldwide Propaganda Network Built by CIA. And it goes on to discuss how the CIA had infiltrated worldwide news networks. However, one of the things that the article does here, there it is, kind of in the first or second paragraph, says, although the CIA has employed dozens of American journalists working abroad, a 3-month inquiry by a team of reporters and researchers for the New York Times has determined, with a few notable exceptions, they were not used by the agency to further worldwide propaganda campaign. So they had this, the New York Times is coming out and saying, look, the CIA definitely was doing propaganda in the news media, but don't, or had it in place to do that, but they never actually went through with it. They went all this effort to set this network up just to not use it. And how do we know that they didn't use it? Well, it's coming from the New York Times, who.
Well, if the New York Times said it, it must be true, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if anybody was in on this on the inside, it would probably be the New York Times. So this is a very, very traditional convention of the media and quote journalists giving you a little bit, but just enough to make you go, oh, I thought something was up. And then saying, but it's not really that bad. It's called a limited hangout. Giving some information in order to prevent discovery of more important information. And that's exactly what you see if you go read through the New York Times article. I'm happy to send you the archive.is link if you want to link it up in the show notes, but people can find that. It's definitely out there. And then shortly after that, just to kind of go through using the media against the media, one of my favorite things to do lately, Carl Bernstein, fairly famous journalist, Carl Bernstein, yes, there it is, in October of 77, had just published, so just before this New York Times article came out, he published an article called The CIA and the Media in Rolling Stone magazine. And basically, this was if it was a limited hangout, it was a less limited hangout. Certainly not unlimited, I don't think, but less limited. And went through and talked about the agency, CIA agency, payrolling many things that were going on in journalism back in the 50s and 60s especially, and that's where you get into Operation Mockingbird happening mostly at that time, if you believe that it ever stopped in full anyway. But Carl Bernstein pointing to Arthur Sulzberger Sr. as working hand in hand with the CIA, and in the 60s, Arthur Sulzberger was the publisher of, well, the New York Times, of course. Bernstein also identified, along with Sulzberger, Henry Luce of Time Incorporated, Time Inc., now Time Warner, AOL Time Warner. So one of the big 6 media companies. Hey, how about that? Used to be Time Inc., and then has been consolidated with all these others. William Paley of CBS, and CBS is owned by Viacom, maybe? Yes, is owned by Viacom now. So, the CIA got rolled into one of those big 6, Henry Luce, Time, William Paley, CIS, and numerous other moguls. And Bernstein was able to find that there were 10 CIA operatives working at the New York Times in the 1950s and 60s alone. So that kind of gives you an idea. I don't really remember what the initial question was that I was trying to answer, but how was it that the media
well, what we're really
should we trust them?
Why shouldn't we trust them, right?
Yeah. And I think, it's obvious that there's evidence from the 70s, just from these 2 articles, that the CIA was setting up, first in the New York Times article, was setting up a propaganda network in the media worldwide. And that then Bernstein article showing that they were actively, not just setting it up, but actively using it. And the Church Committee was kind of trying to figure out how that was played out. But so that's, that's why we shouldn't trust them. They've had 60 or 70 years of experience doing this. And if this came out in the 70s and was able to see the light of day, either that was it and they stopped, or we don't see, and that's why we don't see it now, or they've gotten so much better at it over the subsequent decades that they've been able to keep it from coming to the surface in any major way. And I would certainly say that it's because they've stopped allowing it to come to the surface. I mean, it certainly does, but when only 6 companies have control over the media that 7 billion people get, that's a lot less holes to fill in the dike. The Dutch boy only needs 6 fingers. If there's only 6 places the information is flowing through, he doesn't need 6 fingers and all 10 toes and somebody else, a friend, to kind of plug up this leak of information. He can do it with 1 hand and 1 finger, and that's kind of what we're seeing. That's a analogy that I think is kind of apropos.
But now we have social media and all these other alternative networks popping up, and I think a lot of people tend to think, number one, that like the situation you're describing with the CIA, the deep state, that they have they I think there's a common feeling that people want to trust these agencies, like, they might be keeping some stuff from us and they might be getting involved in these, but it's all for the good of the people, right? It's all to protect the people. Those people are doing what's right, eventually, and they wouldn't, and then people are going to tend to doubt that, these new social media things popping up. They're going to think, it's all organic. It's just like this guy in college, what's his name, the redheaded geeky guy that started Facebook, that he actually created this whole thing, right? Where, my feeling is, from the very inception of these platforms, there's going to be involvement from the deep state. And from what we know of history and hierarchy, behind the deep state, there's a more sinister truth. So how could we lead people a little bit in that direction of understanding the evil behind the deep state, and how they get their sinister fingers in everything?
Well, I think it just goes back to control. I mean,
like, that's a good subject. How do we start from the beginning with people that are like, maybe they're a little curious? Where do you start? It's just such a big world of problems.
Yeah, it really is. And the media infiltration, the media, it's certainly something that I've kind of held as one of the kind of central things to realize in all of this, particularly in the last 9 months, but just generally, is that if you look at any time there's been a kind of government that's been taken over, whether in a invasion or a coup from the inside, or whatever the case may be, one of the first things that almost always happens is the invader, whoever's trying to take the power, basically the first institution they go after usually isn't the military. I mean, usually there's some military related control to a degree, but the first kind of public institution, anyway, that almost always gets taken over is the media. And you can look at that from after the fall, or as Berlin was falling at the end of World War II, the Soviets, especially, as they were the first really to Berlin, the first thing that they did, I mean, before they even really took down the Reichstag and took the last of the Nazi strongholds out, the first thing that they did was grab hold of the print media, the newspaper presses, grabbed hold of the radio transmission towers, grabbed hold of all of the ways to distribute information, knowing that as the Americans were coming, or the Allies were coming, one of the greatest things they could do to retain their power was to start to propagandize the people that really before then had thought, I hope the Allies get here because the Russians are going to, rape our women and kill our children and all this stuff. I hope the Allies get here. Well, you got to propagandize the people. Look, we're not really that bad. Actually, we're better than the Americans, and here's why.
Mm.
And so when you start to see that play out into the Cold War, basically everybody just waking up one morning, and I think was it 1958 or something, 1960 something like. Everybody just woke up one morning and there's this big wall in Berlin, and nobody freaked out. Nobody freaked out because they've been hearing on the radio and in the news press in Berlin and in most of continent, or most of the country of Germany, we're hearing that, really the whole reason that everything went so bad was because you guys moved away from communism and into, this single power fascist state, and gave your authority to a central government as opposed to a workers collective, and how great, the communists were, and all this stuff. And so when people woke up and there was a wall and they could no longer go from one side of Berlin to the other, or one side of Germany to the other, nobody really had a problem with that. They had spent 15 years or so, 10 or 15 years, just inundating people with this information and this one particular one side of the story, that you would rather live over here anyway. Why would you even want to go to West Germany? I mean, that's the heathen capitalist West, where they're going to cut your throat for $5. Meanwhile, give us your money so we can redistribute it evenly among everybody. And so, yeah, that's a really shining example, but there's lots of examples of how,
the weapon of propaganda is probably the most powerful tool or weapon leverage there is, because people are so programmable.
And there's a very good argument to be made that the most dangerous weapon, or maybe not dangerous, but the most powerful weapon in the world, is the narrative. And if you can control the narrative, you can kind of control how and where people are pointing their guns. So the gun's not more powerful than the narrative if the narrative can control the guns. I'm sure the guns can control the narrative, but if people understand what they're supposed to and think the way they're supposed to think, then they're going to do whatever makes sense in line with the narrative that has been forwarded to them. So
I think you just came up with the title for this episode we're about to do: the most powerful weapon in the world.
Well,
that's a good headline.
Fresh on my mind. James Corbett did a article or thing a couple weeks ago.
It's probably been used before.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's something that, my background mainly as a writer and historian, not historian, but researcher of history, particularly history of war and history of, alternative history as well, outside of the mainstream, but then the mainstream narratives of war. And it's just such a pervasive use, the idea that propaganda, the word might have been invented or formalized early in the 1900s, particularly by Edward Bernays and folks around him. But the concept is very, very ancient, whether or not that term was applied to it. But, the understanding has been there. And that's one of the things about, how do we end evil? Well, you got to understand the weapons that they're using against you and figure out how to beat them or use them back against them. And certainly propaganda, certainly the narrative, certainly the message that is being reported is one of the more powerful of those weapons that gets used against people. And a lot of people just don't understand that the media is not your friend. Everybody,
a
lot of people think that the media is there to honestly inform them, and that's just, it's hard to say that that's
sad
true.
And it's frustrating, but that is the case for sure. Like, if you look at the amount of money in the hands of the few, right? And if you spend a little time looking into that, that's not hard to find. You can type in who's got the most money, how much money do they have,
how much more have they made on the backs of small business closing in the last 9 months too. I mean, that's how much richer is Jeff Bezos now than he was 6 months ago, or who, I mean, yeah.
Talk about motives, right?
Yeah.
So who has the motives? Who are these people? And then, when you start looking into bloodlines, and, there's a lot of people done research on these type of things, but it's not easy to find. You have to dig, you have to look a little deeper. But people with that amount of leverage in the world, why would they not use it? Is the question sometimes I ask people. But I think that that's a scary big thing for your average person to bite off. So I don't know.
It is, but you have to look at it. I mean, that's part of it too. If we're really about discovering truth, if we're really about making the best of our brain, making the best of our physical being here. Part of it has to be looking at truth, whether scary or more mundane, and analyzing it the way you would any other piece of information, and really struggling through the hard truth. And that's, yeah, it might be scary for people. It was scary for me at points, absolutely. But to quote the Buddha, the only the only two real sins, the only two real failures in life are not starting and not going all the way. And so if you get to something where, okay, yeah, I feel like I want to get started, and then I look at this and I look at this and I look at this, but this is going to make me go, whoa, because it's too scary. I'm sorry, but it only looks scary. Once you start to apply the truth to it, you start to realize just because it looks scary doesn't mean there's not a way to conquer it. It looks scary because it's in the shadows. It looks scary because, it appears to be a monster. But, think of those old cartoons, Warner Brothers and whatnot, where you look up and on the wall, there's this huge hulking beast coming, shadow of a hulking beast coming. And then the camera pans and it turns out it's a kitty cat. And it's not that the cat was scary. It's that it was the shadow that was scary.
Yep. And then, like Plato's cave is what I think of there too, where, it's these people are looking at the shadows. They're not actually taking the time to, stand up and go look on the other side of the curtain, what's making the shadows. And so,
Precisely.
There's a lot, I feel like there's so much further we could go from there. In fact, I'm already kind of thinking we should do another episode because we're getting towards the end of an hour here and go even deeper into, trying to shed some light on who these people are and where they come from and how they manage to control so many people, and um, sometimes I have trouble with the specifics. So it's probably time that I get back into some more research. Because on my path, I've done a lot of this research and listened to the podcasts and read some books. But, on that path, I get on to other things. And now I'm ending up on the core principles, which is more about how we behave as human beings and how we treat one another, that being the solution to these problems ultimately. And so that's really the main point I try to make on this podcast is, going forward, what can we actually do to make a difference? So why don't you close up a little bit with your thoughts on that?
Sure. Um, well, I'm going to bring it right back to control and this is why I really embraced the idea of control theory, um, especially in the last couple of months, but this whole last year, especially, that's kind of been at the forefront of my mind because, and I'll kind of move from the material into the spiritual, kind of move from the problem and back into the solution if I can here. But um if people say, well, there's just no way that this, people would or could control, well, look, how much control did people 50 years ago have over their food? How many small farms were there where they were selling some of their food, but most of it was feeding their family, and they controlled directly the means of production? Versus now, how many companies control the food supply in the world? And now apply that thinking to the media, to water, to the markets, to finance, to everything that you need to survive or have interpersonal contact on a societal level. Almost all of those things you can go down the list and check off. The consolidation of control has become increasingly and increasingly more consolidated. Okay, so now let's pivot to the solution. Now let's pivot to the spirit. Let's pivot to the principles. So what do you actually control? What do you as an individual actually control? Well, first and foremost, the principal thing that you control is yourself. You control the way that you think. You can control the way that you feel. You can control the way that you act. And therefore, you still have complete control, and you always will. You might have to work that much harder because the means of continuing to function in quote regular society might be a little less in your control, but you have the control. You have the ability to do that. You have the ability to treat other people in a kind of way that doesn't cause suffering to them. And when you control that, the universe will also give you less suffering in your life. When you make certain choices, when you act in accordance with the laws of the universe, you can control the amount of suffering that you have. What you ultimately control are your decisions. What you ultimately control are your thoughts and your emotions and your actions. And in controlling yourself, you can find the path to your freedom. Because, look at Timothy Leary. You can put me in prison, but you're never gonna put my mind in prison. Never gonna happen. He was arrested on 4 different continents. He spent time in a hellhole jail in Afghanistan in the 60s and Algeria in the 70s and some really crazy places. And he came out of every one of those with as big a smile on his face as he did when he went in, because no matter where he was, no matter how much control over his movement he had or what have you, he was able to control the way that he felt about it, control the way that he thought about it, and how he acted to other people. And ultimately, that's a really good, blueprint to me. Not necessarily saying that Tim Leary wasn't part of a particular system of control in some way. Don't get me started with him, but just taking that lesson, forget the man, take the lesson, take the kernel of good practice and good information. But that ultimately, that's the way out, is being conscientious about what you can control and controlling it in a way that you're controlling yourself. You're not controlling other people, because all of this, and maybe to get back to why are we in this? Because some people believe that they have control over or the right to control other people. And just, you can't, you're not capable of controlling other people. It really, truly, the best you can do is convince them to surrender to make the choices in the way that you would have them make their choices. And in essence, give some of that control to somebody else, or really abdicate. You still have it, you're just not really using it. So that's the solution for me. If it's all about control, well, they can't ever win the battle. Evil can't ever fully win, as long as human beings are human beings. If human beings evolve or morph or are technologically bound to something that changes that free will and that ability to control themselves, so that's a different story. That hypothetical world has different parameters. But as long as humans have free will and the ability to control themselves, evil can never win.
And here we are in 2020, where the powers that be are actually putting force on individuals in now a more physical way than ever before in this country, trying to actually control what you put on your face, or how you move your body around, or how close you come to other beings. And they're actually trying to strip that humanity away from us. Whether you think that's justified or not, we can see it happening around us. And to me, the silver lining of that is it provides this motivation. And that's the thread I kind of want to leave with today, is the silver lining thread that, Andy and I reach out and having this conversation is partly due to this craziness of control that's manifesting in a new way. And, like Andy found community in his area, I've reached out and in a new level of bravery and found a community of people that see through the bullshit in my area, and you can too. So I think that's the major takeaway. So why don't you real quick just advertise for your some of your productions. I know you should talk for a second about Winnipeg Alternative Media and your website one more time, and then we'll close it up, and maybe we'll do this again and keep going on this subject.
I would absolutely love to do this again. This has been
Great.
very stimulating, and I think we've only scratched the surface as far as we kind of touched on some of the media stuff, but there's so many threads here. I didn't even get into who funds the media. I mean, to say nothing of the CIA, and just the fact that, and then I'll get on to the closing, but you think the media works for you? What's happening when you're not watching the news on that channel? Somebody is paying the company to put on a bit of propaganda called a television commercial. Who's funding the media? If nothing else, everyone should know that the media gets at least some of its money from advertisers. They want to sell you something. It's clear. That's why they put commercials up all the time. Anyway, so there's a whole deeper. I thought for
Part
sure I would
two.
talk for 20 minutes about that.
No,
We didn't
we'll
even
get
touch
on
on it. So
part two.
that'll be good for the next thing. But okay, so people can find me at greenriveralchemy.com. I've got a handful of videos, did a couple of newsletters that I've put kind of on hold, written newsletters, which I really enjoyed doing. I did those over the summer, did 8 volumes, and it was a lot of work and really got me kind of back into full on writing mode. I have put that on hold for the time being, largely because I have been working with Winnipeg Alternative Media, and now I do a show on Wednesday mornings called Wake Up with Wham, Winnipeg Alternative Media, Wake Up with Wham, where I tackle the globalist agenda and the financial and economic institutions and history and kind of whatever the heck I feel like going on an hour plus rant about, and try to do my best to give people a broader view of where we are and how we have come to be there, and partially how the media has got us there and how we can kind of start to talk about things that get us out. So you can find all that at winnipegalternativemedia.ca for Canada. And you can follow them on Facebook. I'm on Facebook at Andy Alchemy, and I'm very rarely on Facebook. It's kind of just a tool I use to communicate with a lot of the WHAM people, because that platform was started and runs primarily on Facebook, and we're working tirelessly to try and get our 5,000 or so strong viewership to start to feel like they can pivot away from Facebook and onto something like Parler or Float. But yeah, I can be found on those sites. And, you know, the best way really to get a hold of me for just average Joe watching this video, you can go on my website. There's a feedback section, comment section. I see everything. That's just me on that website. I mean, as far as the back end of it. So if you want to get a hold of me, go throw a comment on my website, and it'll have you put your email in. So I'll have your email. You can find me on Facebook. I'll probably get back to you eventually. But that's the best way to get a hold of me. And yeah, check me out on Wednesday mornings on Winnipeg Alternative Media. And I'm going to try and get back into doing more videos. I really got to...
what time does that run, the live show?
That is 10 a.m. Central. So I start at 8 here on the Pacific Coast, and it starts at 11 on the East Coast. And you can find all of that, all of the previous episodes. It's live, but then we archive all the episodes. You can find all the past episodes on winnipegalternativemedia.ca, so you can, you know, check them out there if you can't catch us live, because it's tough for me sometimes. Wednesday mornings 8 a.m. come way too soon. But so people on the West Coast, or certainly people in places like Hawaii, it's really quite early. But you can find it all. You know, it usually gets posted within an hour or two after I'm done. You can find all that stuff there. And excited about my next kind of project that I'm really getting into, as I'm kind of getting to a point where my workload at WHAM, voluntary workload, is kind of getting in hand a little bit, because we are really pushing that platform to try and get a whole bunch of stuff going and get it to a point where we can kind of have it running and step away, because I'm a very late comer to Winnipeg Alternative Media. I'm just trying to kind of move them to the next, help them move to the next level, not move them, help them move to the next level. But my next big project is Natural Law, Alchemy, and the Bible. And I'll probably be doing a fairly long video and then probably a regular podcast on that here in the next month or so. That's my next big project. But
Right
just
on.
to, you know, alchemy is kind of my favorite way of talking about all this hermetic and occulted stuff, because, you know, alchemy, people are like, well, what is that? Whereas if you're like, well, it's the occult, people are like, whoa, alchemy is some, you know, crazy guy from the 1400s in a sooty lab, and it's kind of a fun story.
With
but
the pointy hat.
Yeah, with the pointy hat, exactly. And then, of course, you know, tying alchemy, which is kind of, oh, that's interesting, and the Bible, which I think you can really, there's really a strong case to say that the Bible might be one of the most comprehensive, at least long, alchemical texts in history. So my idea is to try and tie all these things together. And there's actually, when you get into not just the alchemy, the psychological and spiritual alchemy, there's actually instances of actual alchemy, chemical alchemy, transmutation of actual physical elements in the Bible. And so there's a bunch of stuff like that I'm
turning water to wine.
Turning water to wine. That's a good one. The manna from heaven in the Old Testament. That was, so there's a lot of that stuff in there. So that's kind of my next big project that is in the works. It has been for too long now.
Right on. Well, I'm looking forward to checking out that work, and looking forward to our next conversation. Obviously, we got a lot more to go on here, so we'll continue this. And but thanks so much for meeting me today, Andy. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. I look forward to doing this again.
All right, right on. Thanks, folks, for checking out the End Evil podcast.